Just subliminal things.
Well, can I bump you about that? Because I'm going to ask them about that. I said, and it's similar to like, what do they tell them? What do they teach them? And they, one thing I learned is, so just little things like that. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to have to have a conversation.
We make them worse. How much got put there?
He just now when he waits a year, house price can come down 20 or 30. So, and that's what I told Ryan. I was like, look, I understand, and I'm not even trying to suppress your independence, but financially, you stay with me, the bigger your business. And with the way things are around here, you sit on that house for a year, take your job 29% in a year. I mean, it may not, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Good morning.
Well, I may end up bumping it.
Just a minute, we're going to ask
Because really,
John Henry to lead us in prayer. Either him or the last one to sit down. Who do we need to remember in our prayers this morning? Robert Collins. They don't know why? Okay. So let's remember Robert Collins. He's in the hospital and they don't have much more information for us than that. Who else do we need to remember this morning?
Terry and Marty and Cynthia. They had to out there yesterday.
Okay. Are we getting close?
She was having some episodes, so they're going to do this today or tomorrow one for sure.
Okay, so let's remember Marty and Cynthia's oldest daughter, Carrie. She's pregnant and she's having some kind of episode. So Marty and Cynthia.
Huh? They're going to induce.
within a day or two.
Today or tomorrow one for sure.
All right, so they're also going to induce, and Marty and Cynthia are out there. So their quiver's getting fuller than mine, and I'm jealous. Who else do we need to remember? Yeah.
Bob Wood, Bill, he's a Tallahassee, not doing well.
Okay. All right, let's remember Bob Woods. Anybody?
Lola Nancy's back at home and doing pretty well.
That's a praise, so let's be thankful for that.
Praise, that's right.
Any other praises? All right, John Henry.
Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you first and foremost for our help, our ability to come and study your word this morning. May Heavenly Father, Lord, we glean something from it. So pray, Heavenly Father, Lord, for our prayer list is great in number. want you to remember Marty and Cynthia as they traveling, and their daughter, as this pregnancy is coming to an end. Pray Heavenly Father for a healthy child. Ask Heavenly Father, Lord, you be with us as we try to put the world behind us and keep it out of the building and learn, give honor and praise to thee. Forgive us where we come short. Christ's name I pray.
Amen. All right, so all week I prepared to bring y'all a study this morning on Exodus 32. Worked on it all day yesterday. Worked on it 2 hours this morning. We're going to go back to Exodus 19. We may or may not even get to Exodus 32 this morning. Oh my, I just saw somebody else here with us. Carol's not going to hear a word I say. You tell her, Luke. I got a question for you. What is the opposite of faith? I hear unbelief. What else? Doubt. Despair. I hope to convince you by the end of the lesson that the opposite of faith is fear. And it's really important in hindsight that we get this Exodus 19 correct before we go to Exodus 32. I have another question for you. What is the difference between interpretation and translation?
Interpretation is like your own view of what was said. The other one, translation means that it's in one language switched to another language according to your view.
Okay. So in court nowadays, we have to use interpreters. Before I was judge, I had never seen an interpreter. I had been to court for 20 years. Criminal court, everything. My first day on the bench, I had a man there that could only speak Baton, Filipino language. I routinely, at least monthly, have to have an interpreter. For a period of time there, the Supreme Court put me on a statewide board governing court-appointed interpreters. There is a word, and when they appear for a case, I have to swear them in that they will make an honest and accurate interpretation of what's said. We don't use the word translation. And the reason we don't is these interpreters are hearing something in one language. And they're not telling us word for word what the other person is saying in the order that those words are presented. They're doing kind of like what the NIV does. They take what's said and they do their best to present it to us in a way that we can more accurately understand what is said. That's why I like the NLT. It's not my daily driver for a Bible translation. And this is where we get confused about what a translation is. I like the New King James. But I suggest to you, and I hope to, in a small way, convince you this morning that all of these Bibles are interpretations and they're not translations. Back in chapter 19, God appears to the children of Israel at Sinai, and they set up some boundaries, and there's some instructions, and Moses goes up the mountain, and they're talking. Let me get right to the verse that we're going to talk about. And there comes a point in time that after the instructions were given, that God tells Moses to go down the mountain. Chapter 20, verse 21, chapter 19, verse 21. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish, unless the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. And then Moses says in verse 23, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set boundaries around the mountain and consecrate it. And that passage has puzzled me. Has it puzzled any of you? Because all of that was already laid out beforehand. Let's look at verse. Let's just look at it kind of globally let's start up at chapter 1. Verse 1, they get to Sinai. And then God tells them who he is and what he has done for them. Then he says through verses 4 through 6, you're going to be a holy people, a kingdom of priests. And so Moses and in verse 7, you got Moses and the elders of the people, and Moses laid it out what God has said. They even hear God speak to Moses. They assent to the covenant in verse 8. God appears as a cloud, verse 9. Then he tells them to consecrate themselves in verse 10. Someone read for me. Kevin, you read 10 through 13.
Then the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow. Whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near the mountain.
All right. Do you remember when we were talking about Exodus 19 the first time? I told you that some commentaries said that this section, starting here in 19, through the rest of the book pretty much, wasn't written in chronological order. And I told you I couldn't see it. I was wrong. It's not written in a linear fashion. And I'm not going to try, beyond a small little example here, just one example here this morning, I'm not going to try through the rest of this book to put it to teach this non-linear fashion. And it's primarily for one good reason. It would take me 2 or 3 weeks to understand it. And then it'd take me another 2 or 3 weeks to organize it in a way that I could try to teach it in a manner that people could understand it. But it absolutely, in my opinion now, is not written in a linear fashion. And we're going to see it. Back around 4 through 6 of chapter 19, what does God call these people? What does God want? Holy nation. He wants a kingdom of priests. I suggest to you that when we're done with this chapter and chapter 32, he doesn't have that. Instead of having a kingdom of priests, he has a kingdom with priests. And you'll see some of that today, and you'll see some of that, Lord willing, when we get back to chapter 32. Look at verse 13. It says, not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow, whether man or beast, he shall not live. Then he says, when the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near the mountain. Well, weren't they near the mountain already? Does anyone's translation there, I don't think anybody does. Does anyone's translation there have something other than the word near for near the mountain?
Mine says up.
Mine says they go up on the mountain.
Okay, what translation's that? Okay, all right, the NLT's got it. The word there for near is not near. And I was listening to these people that I respect, and they said that, and I was like, well, I don't know. You know, the sacred version, the New King James, it says near. It's got to mean near. So I've got it with Strong's, and so I look up that word near there, and in Hebrew it's ALA, where that's, I don't know how to pronounce it. There's got all kind of funny little pronunciation symbols there, and it's ALA. It doesn't mean near. It never means near. I didn't know the new NLT got it right. The New Revised Standard also gets it right. It gets it literally right. It calls it on. So what God is saying there, we're going to kill whatever gets up on this mountain, and then we're going to sound the trumpet. After we sound the trumpet, the people shall come on the mountain. Yes, John Henry.
The Record King James says up to the mountain.
Up to the mountain. See, it's trying. All right, so remember when I asked you if there was a difference between translation and interpretation? If your translation says up to or near, that's an interpretation. Because what they did is they're looking at the rest of chapter 19 here. And they're trying to make this verse make sense within the body of chapter 19, but it doesn't. That's why I get confused when he's having this discussion with Moses. God's plan all along was they were to consecrate themselves. Well, why do you consecrate yourself?
Go somewhere that's holy,
To come into the presence of God. It was God's intent all along for these children of Israel to come up this mountain. But something changes. And they don't. Okay? And there's a consequence to this. But all along, he wanted them to come up the mountain. His plan was to consecrate the people, have the people hear the word of God. There would be a sounding of the trumpet, and then they're going to come up. Well, in verses 16 and 17, the trumpet sounds. Dan, read for us 16 and 17. What translation are you reading from?
NIV.
Okay.
On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain.
All right. What did Moses do when he heard the trumpet? He's bringing them to God. What do the people do? They tremble. All right, so remember I told you it wasn't written in linear fashion. You have this dialogue where he says, go down the mountain. And then we get the Ten Commandments all of a sudden. So let's flip, hold your place here, and let's flip to chapter 20. Starting with verse 1, we have the introduction of the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments run through verse 13. Then we get verse 18. And verse 18, they're still there. They're still in the presence of all this. Lori, will you read 18? Now, I may regret this because you got the NLT. I hadn't checked it, but will you read for me 18 and 19 out of verse 20? Chapter 20.
When the people heard the thunder and loud blast of the ram's horn, and when they saw the flashes of lightning and the smoke billowing from the mountain, they stood at a distance, trembling with fear. And they said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak directly to us or we will die.
All right. So now they're standing afar off. I get the impression they're backing up. All right. So then look at verse 21. Lori, read 21 for us.
As the people stood in the distance, Moses approached the dark cloud.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Start in verse 20.
Don't be afraid, Moses answered them, for God has come in this way to test you, and so that your fear of him will keep you from sinning. As the people stood in the distance, Moses approached the dark cloud where God was.
All right, so he's telling them what? Verse 20?
Fear.
Don't fear. They're backing up. He says, don't fear. This is a test. But do they go up? They back up. They stand afar off. Well, let me ask you this. Was Moses afraid? He was. He was. Okay, so here's your other. Fear is the opposite of faith. But bravery is acting in the face of fear. Turn to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews 12, Paul redescribes this whole event for his own purposes. And in Hebrews 12, verse 21, Matt, will you read that for us when you get there? And now realize I'm just taking a verse out here. I'm not reading that whole passage. It starts up around 20 or so, but what's 21?
And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake.
Moses was terrified. But what did Moses do?
Okay.
Moses climbed the mountain. Paul would go on to say in verse 25, when he's talking to us and he's illustrating what we have relative to what they have, he says in verse 25, see that you do not what? Refuse him. Why does he say that? Because he's saying that's what the people, that's what the children of Israel did. They refused him because they feared. And it's important to realize this because when we get to chapter 32, I'm going to ask you to compare Moses up to that point in time to Moses in chapters 3 and 4. And I want you to think about contrasting Moses to the people of Israel. Because we know what they do in chapter 32. And I suggest to you, they did it out of fear. That's why when God says, and he sees that fear, and he tells Moses to go down the mountain and don't let them up, after he's already instructed that they come up, it's because that fear isn't faith. And you can't approach him in that manner. That's why, in my opinion, this is how it makes sense. I didn't invent this. I'm sitting there, I'm listening to something while I'm working out, and I heard something I didn't believe, that New King James and all the other translations mistranslated that word because they're interpreting it. And I was like, no, that just cannot be. And I checked it out, and he's absolutely right. And it made sense about what they were saying about how it's not written in a linear fashion. And there are more examples of that in this portion of Exodus. It's purposefully written this way. It's written not to be easy. That's how I see it. It's written for us to have to dig. You can learn most of the lessons from it, reading it just the way you read it. But there are going to be some aspects to it like this that you're not going to get unless you listen to somebody on a podcast that explains it to you in a way that makes you feel like an idiot. And that's why I came here with this first before we go into chapter 32. All right. So, any questions? That went a little faster than I thought it would. Any questions about this before we move forward? Any comments?
It doesn't bother me that it's not linear or chronological because the Gospels aren't. You know, they're told with a purpose and a theme. The Old Testament books of the Bible aren't even arranged chronologically. Yes, I don't have any problem with that. My favorite part of that is that God wanted them there. He wanted all of them up there, and then because of their fear, they don't all go. That is a very interesting thought.
Another thing they said, you know, a lot of times I'll talk about a chiastic structure, and I'll say it's a poetic structure where the first thing mentioned ties to the last thing mentioned, and then the second thing mentioned ties to the next to last thing mentioned. They had the most brilliant way to describe it. It's a cheeseburger. It's a double cheeseburger. You got buns on the outside, you got patties on the inside, and you got a slice of cheese in the middle. And the purpose of that chiastic structure is for you to contrast the buns and get to the cheese. And that's all in here also. And I'm not going to go into the chiastic structure here, but I just, if you ever hear me say chiastic again, think of a cheeseburger. And I thought that was the most brilliant illustration. And I've never heard it, and it makes the world of sense. Yes.
Do you think, and it's speculation, but so the mountain's on fire,
Mm-hmm.
the mountain is shaking,
Mm-hmm.
quaking,
Mm-hmm.
and so are the children of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
If God had waited to quake the mountain and set it on fire until the children of Israel were on the mountain, almost like a Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thing, you know, I'm standing on a mountain and now it starts to quake because the children of Israel, now they're going to go up, you know, because it's different. You think God made it quake, made it smoke, and set the mountain on fire to say to the children of Israel, you don't belong in my presence, actually. You really don't where I am, you really shouldn't come. I'm inviting you, but your fear is keeping you from coming because where I am is different from where you are.
I had those same thoughts this weekend. And I prepared this whole thing about how God has set all this up. And because of the fear, because I got to looking at why did they do this? They do this out of fear. And why are they fearful? And they're fearful because Moses was gone for 40 days. Moses was their intercessor and they feared God. And I thought, well, God back in chapter 3 and 4, he said, I'm going to make you the leader. Chapter 19, he says, I'm going to do some things with you in the presence of the people so they will see you as a leader. And so I'm wondering, well, did God set all this up? And I really don't think so now. And the reason I don't is because God had a plan when they feared. And Moses talks him out of the plan. He was going to kill them. That was his knee-jerk reaction. He was going to kill them all. And he was going to start over with Moses. And so I don't think it was his plan all along now, because it wasn't going to be his plan all along to kill them. All right, so, but let's get back. You brought out trembling and quaking and the trembling. Well, I'll just jump ahead and foreshadow a little bit. When the children of Israel see Moses ascending that mountain, what did it look like was happening to the mountain?
Looks like it's going to burn up. Yes.
Looks like it's going to burn out. They thought it was being consumed is the word. It's going to be consumed by the fire. And then they see Moses ascend into it. And he's gone for 40 days. So it may be very reasonable for them to think that he was consumed by the fire. When Moses is up there, remember now we have skipped, we're getting into 32 now. We have skipped because it's not linear. Or now we're looking at it from two different points of view. After, starting in verse 25 through chapter 31, we get more instruction. This is all written from Moses's point of view, that 40 days. But then we get down to chapter 32, we're in the people's point of view. And when God sees what they're going to do, he says, I'm going to consume them. So there are some of these word plays and pairings that go on. But before we get to 32, let's just remember in chapter 24, 16 through 18. Mark, will you read that for us?
24, 16 through 18.
Yes, sir.
Now the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. The sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights.
All right. So now we've already talked about the people a little bit. Let's skip to the 40 here. Moses is on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. When he's done with those 40 days and 40 nights, what does he bring down with him? The tablets. Now, they don't last long, but he's bringing them down. Who else had 40 days and 40 nights? Jesus. When Jesus, he goes out there to be what? Tested or tempted, yeah. And when he's done, what does he start to do? He's going to start bringing us the law of the New Testament. He's going to have that Sermon on the Mount that says, Moses told you this, but I tell you that. Moses fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus fasted this same period of time. Jesus was tested. But is Moses tested? Or is it the children of Israel were the ones that were tested? Yes.
Possibly a little of both.
I don't know if you're in the presence of God. I don't know if it's a test anymore. that's my thinking. You know, he's there. He's with God.
Well, only because of the verse you gave us earlier from Hebrews that Moses is the one that says, hey, don't fear, God has done this to test you so you won't whatever. Well, your Hebrews verse said Moses was afraid too, but he passed the test because he went ahead and walked into the fire.
Yeah, but then he walks up.
But now he's not being quoted.
And once he walks up and he's there with God, he's there 40 days.
So, yeah.
So the fear was before.
God was tested. The people tested God.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Because of their rebellion.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
what it ultimately comes down to. And it's, you know, it's every day, you know, since he created man has tested God.
We don't want to be there, do we? All right. Before we talk about what the people actually did, because I want to break it down. What did the people not do? Okay, they didn't obey, but they're fearful. And they're going to look for a solution. What did they not do?
They didn't remember all the things that just happened.
Okay, that's a good one. All right.
They didn't go up on the mountain.
Well, now they can't. God said, you know, after he saw how they were fearful and they backed up, he changed his mind and said, hey, tell them not to come up the mountain. They didn't pray. They never prayed to God about their problem. They never asked Aaron or Hur, who Moses said before he goes up that last little bit, he says, look, if y'all need something, see, you got Aaron and Hur. You go to them. Well, they go to Aaron, but do they ask Aaron to pray for them to Yahweh? They don't do that. And there's a lot of commentators, and I was leaning this way till I really dove into it hard. There's a lot of commentators that want to really defend the children of Israel. And I'm really not here. They have, yes, they did what they did out of fear, but they completely, in my opinion, reject God. Completely. So let's break it down. The first thing they do is they seek other gods. What does that violate? The first commandment. Make us other gods, Elohim is the word they use. I'm stressing that because when we get later, they're going to do something else. Then they ask Aaron to do what for them? Make them an idol. Okay? What does that violate? The second commandment. Remember, they just got these 10 commandments. And then some more law. They got the 10 commandments in the book of the covenant. Then Moses goes up to get more instruction. So they just got these things. They've already promised 3 times to do all of it. Once in chapter 19, twice in chapter 24. We will obey. Then chapter 32 verse 8, they worship the calf. What does that violate? Second commandment again. Then Aaron says, we're going to have a festival to the Lord. The Lord there is what? What's the word there for you, Lord? Someone said it. It's Yahweh. Make us other gods. He makes them a calf. He even forms it. Or I forget the exact word that he uses there for the mold. He gives it to the people, and then he says, we're going to have a festival not to Elohim, which could mean anybody. We're going to have a festival to Yahweh. What does that violate? In my opinion, what does that violate? Let's see if y'all are
Profaning his name.
profaning his name. They are associating the name of God with an idol. All right. Let's drop down one more step. And it says that they say, the people say, what did the people say in verse 4? Anybody?
These are your gods.
These are your gods who did what? What did God say in the beginning of chapter 19 and then again in chapter 20? Exactly. They are mocking God. He said, before we get to chapter 19 in depth, he says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. When he begins the 10 Commandments, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. They pop out this calf and they say, these are the gods that brought us out of the land of Egypt.
You know, it's easy to read this and think God's reaction is too harsh to want to wipe them all out. And what you're painting is a very clear picture is he would have been very much justified to do so.
It continues. It gets worse. Then in chapter 24, and they're doing this consecration. How does Moses begin the consecration in chapter 24, verses 4 and 5?
The Lord built an altar at the foot of the mountain.
Okay, so he rose early. He built the altar and he started the sacrifices. Now flip back to chapter 32 and verse 6. What do the people do? They rise early and do their own sacrifices. They're mocking God's way of consecrating people to be in his presence.
Verse 7 gives you better context about that.
Okay, go ahead, read it.
And the Lord said to Moses, go, get down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves.
And that was where I was going to get to, another step removed, but we're good to take it right there. You're exactly right. So the next thing that I see that they did is they continued to mock the consecration and possibly violate the 7th commandment against adultery and the 10th commandment involving covetousness, because when it says that they rose up to play, that's a sexual connotation. And the word there, and I didn't write it all down, if you track that Hebrew word back, it's usually associated with sexual activity. So they're having a drunken orgy and they're associating it with things that God used to make people holy. When Moses told them to consecrate themselves in chapter 19, what additional commandment did he give them with respect to their wives?
Don't touch them.
Don't touch your wives. I don't know who all they're touching here. And that's why I'm saying they're violating the consecration. So then getting back to Kevin's point, this corruption is essentially a reversal of the consecration. You consecrate yourself to cleanse yourself, to set yourself apart, to make yourself holy, so that you can enter the presence of God. And God has said here in verse 7, they have just undone all of that. And that's why I no longer think, I mean, it's almost systematic the way they did this. And then Moses comes down the mountain. We're going to skip ahead to verse 26. Moses comes down the mountain. He's mad now. You know, he's up there and God's mad and he's trying to appease God. Then Moses comes down and sees for himself what's going on, and he gets hot. And I think that's even the word that it uses there. He starts burning hot. He breaks the 10 Commandments, which in my opinion is him saying, there is no more covenant. Because I'm breaking it. Because you broke it. And then in verse 26, he says, if you're on the Lord's side, come over here and stand with me. Well, who comes? The Levites. That's where you get your priests. He's now, instead of having a kingdom of priests, he's got a kingdom with priests. The Levites step up. And they shun the opportunity to repent. And we'll pick up, Lord willing, Wednesday from there.
Nice detour.
It's scary. Y'all get a peek into his brain.
Look, it takes weeks and it takes hours to prepare what you only get minutes to. You know what I mean? Like the hours of what you retain, and then you gotta boil it down. I mean, that's it.
Thanks, Fred. It did it to me too. It did it to me. I was too. That's the reason why I had to go over that detour this morning. I was like, look, no one else.
They'll go.
Hey, Tanina. See, I know Ananda when I see you. I know Ananda when I see you. Oh, that's Nana. I know it. I know it.
He wants to go with them. Now, can you send something to that, or do you need my email? Okay. All right. Very good. Very, very good.
What's your big brother?
Waited for just please don't.
Go ahead.
Good morning. I've got several announcements this morning. First off, visitors, we're glad that you're here. We thank you for being with us, and come back and join us each and every opportunity that you have. I've got a card from Miss Ann that she wanted me to read to the congregation. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank all of you for everything that's been done for Rob and me in the last several weeks. The phone calls, texts, and cards all meant so very much. The awesome meals that our dear ladies brought were all so special and greatly appreciated. Adversity often brings a greater appreciation for what's important in our lives.